In this video, we're going to prove a very important theorem. Actually, it's the corollary, a consequence of the last theorem. If S and V and T are both bases for a vector space V, then the number of elements in S must equal the number of elements in T. The proof is straightforward. That is, it follows immediately from the last theorem. Okay, so here it goes. S is a basis for V. And now that means that S is a linearly independent set. For right now, we're just going to concentrate on S being a linearly independent set. And T is a basis for V. We're just going to concentrate on those two statements. Now we can say by the previous video or theorem, we know that n must be less than or equal to m. The number of vectors in a linearly independent set must be less than the number of vectors in a basis. That is, linearly independent set must be less than the vectors in a basis. V must be less than or equal to n. Okay, now let's change this game. How about, so now we know that T is a basis for V. That is, so T is a linearly independent set. Let's work with that, because every basis is a linearly independent set. And S is a basis for V. And I should say that in both cases, S is a linearly independent set for V, linearly independent set for V. Okay. And S is a basis for V. By the previous video, we know that the number of elements in the linearly independent set, T, which is M, has to be no bigger than the number of vectors in S, a basis. And that number of elements is N. Okay. Now, if N is less than or equal to M and M is less than or equal to N, then we must conclude that N equals M. If N is less than M and M is less than N, we conclude that the only way that can happen is if N equals M. Two vectors, two bases for the same vector space V, they have to have the same number of elements. That completes this theorem. It's a very important one. And I do want to say one thing. Don't want to call this a theorem. I'm going to call it a corollary, which means consequence. Consequence of what? The previous theorem. So if you have a theorem and you prove it, and then you say, hey, wait a minute, an immediate consequence of this is this other fact. We generally call that fact a corollary. Okay, it's something that immediately follows from a theorem. If I show you that if you add two even numbers, you get another even number, then a corollary, a consequence of that is If you add two multiples of 4, which are even numbers, of course, you'll get an even result. It follows immediately. If you like videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. Tell your friends and families and enemies about my channel. Ask them to watch and learn, and hopefully subscribe. Like to see you folks in the next video. Please watch and learn.